Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that's, well, it's exactly what it says on the tin. We're going to talk about why a powerful ancient empire built reservoirs bigger than some modern towns, and hopefully it will be just boring enough to gently lull you off to sleep. Picture yourself standing on a vast, flat plain under a scorching sun. The air is thick, humid, and smells faintly of damp earth and blooming jasmine. You can feel the distant rumble of a mighty river, the lifeblood of this ancient world, but also a force capable of wiping everything away in a heartbeat. It's a landscape defined by water, too much or too little, rarely just right. Navigating this world, building a civilization here, was a challenge you probably wouldn't survive without their ingenious solutions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on that plain, feeling the ancient dust beneath your bare feet, imagining a time long before air conditioning or weather forecasts. This is the heartland of what would become one of Southeast Asia's most remarkable empires, the Khmer. Their story, the story of Angkor, is inextricably linked to water. Not just streams and puddles, oh no, we're talking about the behemoths of the natural world here. You have the Mekong River, a serpentine giant that flows down from the Himalayas, spilling across plains and deltas, bringing life and sometimes chaos. And then there's the Tonle Sap, often called the Great Lake, which is perhaps the most fascinating character in this watery drama. Imagine a lake that breathes. Seriously, for half the year during the dry season, it's a respectable size, a large lake supplying fish and water. But when the monsoon rains hit, and the Mekong swells with meltwater from distant mountains and torrents from the sky, something incredible happens. The Mekong's flow becomes so powerful that it reverses the current of the Tonle Sap River, forcing the lake to expand, sometimes quadrupling its surface area, spilling out into the surrounding forests and fields. This annual flood pulse is a phenomenon almost unique in the world, transforming the landscape from dry, cracked earth to a vast inland sea before slowly receding again. This wasn't just a seasonal inconvenience. It was the defining rhythm of life. Your ancestors here, eking out a living in this dynamic environment, lived by the lake's pulse. When the waters rose, they moved to higher ground, fishing in the newly flooded forests. When the waters receded, they planted crops in the incredibly fertile soil left behind, rich with sediment from the mountains. This cycle dictated everything. When you fished, when you planted, when you sowed, when you built, when you prayed. It was a life lived on the edge of abundance and scarcity, flood and drought. It teaches you humility, right? Or maybe just a really good swimming stroke. You wouldn't want to be caught off guard when the lake decides to have a growth spurt. Before the grandeur of Angkor, before the mighty temples and the truly colossal reservoirs, smaller communities existed here, managing water on a local scale. They dug ponds, built simple dikes to hold back or channel water, and developed techniques for fishing in the flooded forests. These early interactions were about survival, adapting to the wild, untamed power of nature. But even then, water wasn't just a resource, it was sacred. The sheer transformative power of the flood, the life it brought and took, the mystery of the lake swelling like a pregnant deity, it instilled a deep reverence, or perhaps a healthy dose of fear. Water deities were powerful figures in their pantheon, controlling the rains, the floods, the fertility of the land. Controlling water, even in a small way, must have felt like tapping into divine power itself. As societies grew, becoming more complex with villages turning into towns, the need for a more predictable food supply increased. You couldn't build a powerful kingdom, supporting priests, artisans, and a nascent administrative class, if everyone was just waiting for the lake to decide how much rice they could plant that year. The unpredictable nature of the monsoon, the variability of the flood pulse. One year too little rain meant drought and starvation. The next year too much meant crops washed away. This inherent instability was a natural bottleneck to growth and centralization. This is where we start seeing the stirrings of larger ambitions, the shift from small local water management to something more systematic. The idea wasn't just to live with the water, but to master it, to harness its power, to smooth out those brutal peaks and troughs. It was a massive intellectual and engineering leap, moving from passive adaptation to active control. Imagine the discussions around the fire. Okay, so the lake does its thing, right? What if we kept some of that water when it's high and used it when it's low, like a really big bucket? The sheer audacity of it, given the tools and knowledge they had, is pretty humbling. It wasn't just about farming, it was about population growth, political stability, and the very legitimacy of the rulers who claimed the right to organise such monumental tasks. Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of large-scale water management in the region predated the Khmer Empire's formal beginning or developed concurrently with its rise. Some evidence suggests earlier, cultures like Funan had significant hydraulic works, potentially laying some groundwork, while others argue the unique scale and complexity of the Angkorian system was a true innovation of the Khmer period itself. It's a fascinating debate, like arguing whether the first person to stack 2 rocks invented walls or just a slightly taller rock. Regardless of the exact lineage, the stage was set. The geography presented the challenge. Immense fertility tied to immense unpredictability. The religious beliefs imbued water with divine power. And the societal pressures, as communities grew and centralized power emerged, created the need for control. You can feel the forces converging, can't you? The land, the water, the people, the gods, the kings, all pointing towards one inevitable conclusion. Someone, somewhere, was going to have to get really good at moving dirt and holding back water. And they were going to do it on a scale that would make your average modern civil engineer raise an eyebrow. They were about to build something enormous, something that would define their civilization and feed millions. Something much bigger than just a pond. You've felt the earth, you've sensed the rhythm of the water's breath and the tonless sap expanding and contracting the Mekong's mighty pulse. Living like that, utterly dependent on nature's unpredictable moods is, well, it keeps you humble. It also keeps your population numbers pretty limited. Small villages can adapt, maybe move inland when the flood comes, fish the forests, plant quickly when it recedes. But as those villages grow, as families have more children, as people start specialising, some becoming potters, others weavers, others perhaps even early administrators or religious figures, you need stability. You can't have your entire workforce scrambling to higher ground or starving because the rain didn't come this year. You need a surplus, a safety net, a way to ensure that even when nature is being, let's say, temperamental, there's still food on the table. Or, rice in the basket. This is the moment where the simple life of adaptation starts bumping up against the ambitions of a rising power. The early Khmer rulers, consolidating their control over this region, faced a fundamental challenge. How do you build a kingdom, a sophisticated society, maybe even an empire, on a foundation of ecological uncertainty? How do you gather enough people, enough resources, enough trust from your population if basic survival is a yearly gamble? You can't tax people who are starving, you can't recruit armies from flooded villages, and you definitely can't convince thousands of labourers to build massive stone temples if they're constantly worried about the next harvest failing. The answer, they've realised, lay in controlling the water, not just living with it. It was a shift from passive acceptance to active manipulation of the environment, driven by the very practical needs of supporting a growing, complex society and the very ambitious goals of its rulers. This era, as the Khmer state began to coalesce, saw the first steps towards larger, more organised water management. Forget the individual family pond you dug with a shovel, or, a sharpened stick and determination. We're talking about projects that required coordination, planning and significant communal labour. Under kings like Jayavarman Nek, often credited with unifying disparate territories and laying the groundwork for the Angkor period in the early 9th century, the focus shifted. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about power. Building large public works, like reservoirs and canals, served multiple purposes. It physically transformed the landscape, yes, making agriculture more reliable, but it also transformed society. Organising thousands of people to dig, move earth and build required a level of centralised authority and logistical capability that simply didn't exist before. It was a statement. I, your king, can command the very earth and water and bring you prosperity. Which, let's be honest, is a pretty good pitch if you want to keep your throne. These weren't yet the absolutely colossal braes that would later define Angkor, the ones you've probably heard snippets about. Think of them more as ambitious precursors, perhaps larger moats surrounding early capital cities or temple complexes, serving not just defensive purposes, but also as significant water storage. Maybe the beginnings of longer canals, designed to drain flooded areas for cultivation or connect settlements for transport, rather than just small irrigation ditches. They were stepping stones, proving grounds for the engineering and organisational skills that would be needed later. It was like they started with a wading pool, then moved to an Olympic-sized pool before eventually deciding, you know what? Let's just build a lake. You start to see the landscape around these early centres being subtly reshaped. Earth moved, levees built, channels dug. It's not as dramatic as diverting a major river yet, but it's a significant undertaking. Imagine the sheer manpower needed. Thousands of people working under the tropical sun with basic tools, baskets to carry earth, simple hoes to loosen soil. It puts your last gardening project into perspective, doesn't it? Trying to dig a flower bed probably felt like building a pyramid compared to this. This wasn't just about moving water, it was about moving earth, on a scale unprecedented for the time in this region. This period also saw the initial integration of water management into the very fabric of the city itself. Early temple sites and settlements weren't just placed near water. They were designed with water features as integral elements. Moats became wider, more significant. Pools and tanks appeared within temple precincts, not just for practical use, but for ritual purification and symbolic representation. The city wasn't just on the landscape, it was a deliberate reshaping of the landscape, where buildings and water features worked together in a planned, often geometrically precise layout. It hinted at the concept of the hydraulic city, a city whose very existence and structure were intertwined with its water system that would fully blossom later. A quirky tidbit about this early period: some sources suggest that the alignment and design of some early moats and reservoirs weren't just purely functional. There might have been efforts to orient them towards specific celestial events or integrate them into a cosmic plan reflecting Hindu or Buddhist cosmology, mapping the earthly realm onto the divine. Imagine building a massive ditch not just to hold water, but because its angle aligns with a constellation important for predicting the monsoon. Practicality and spirituality walking hand in hand, or perhaps digging side by side, as it were. Historians still argue whether these early projects were primarily agricultural in purpose, focused purely on irrigation and flood control to boost rice production, or if their religious, political, and symbolic functions were equally or even more important at this stage. Was the goal food security first, with the other benefits as happy accidents? Or was it about displaying kingly power and divine favour, with increased food production being a welcome but secondary outcome? It's like debating whether you clean your room for hygiene or just so your mum stops nagging you. Often, it's a bit of both, isn't it? But understanding the primary driver helps unlock the overall intent behind their monumental efforts. The labour, the planning, the sheer will required to start reshaping this dynamic environment, it was immense. It laid the foundation of knowledge and experience. They learned what worked and what didn't. They figured out how to estimate the immense volumes of earth needed, how to organise and feed a workforce the size of a small modern town, how to predict the behaviour of water on a large scale. These weren't small feats, they were mastering the fundamentals of hydraulic engineering through trial, error, and probably a lot of very muddy, very tired labourers. This era was crucial. It was the period of experimentation, of proving the concept. It showed that large-scale water management was possible here, that it could provide stability, and that it could be a powerful tool for state building. It wasn't the peak of their hydraulic achievements, but it was arguably the most important phase, the one where they decided to take destiny into their own hands and begin the long, slow earth-moving march towards creating something truly monumental, something that would feed millions and stand as a testament to their ingenuity for centuries. The stage was set, the basic techniques were being refined, and the ambition was just beginning to swell, much like the Tonle Sap itself. So you've seen them learning, experimenting, figuring out the basics of moving earth and water on a larger scale. Those early moats and simple canals, they were just warm-ups, because the Khmer rulers, as their power grew, didn't just want stability, they wanted control. They wanted surplus on a scale that could support millions of people, fuel ambitious building programs, and project an image of divine authority. And they realized that to do that, they needed to go from building wading pools to building inland seas. This is where you enter the Golden Age, the peak of the Angkorian Empire, roughly from the 10th to the 12th centuries. This is when the really big stuff happened. The kind of stuff that makes modern engineers scratch their heads and wonder, how on earth we're talking about the creation of the barrays? Now, the term barray just means reservoir, but that doesn't quite capture it. These weren't just large ponds, they were rectangular bodies of water, often miles long and wide, enclosed by massive earthen dikes, and I mean massive. Take the West Barray, for example. You can still see its outlines today. It's about 8 kilometers long and just over 2 kilometers wide. Do the math. That's something like 16 square kilometers of water surface. To put that in perspective, depending on how you measure it, that's roughly the size of Manhattan's Central Park multiplied by 4, or bigger than many modern cities' downtown cores. Imagine digging a hole that big and building walls around it, using only human power and simple tools. It's a staggering thought, isn't it? Makes putting up IKEA furniture feel like a Herculean task. These weren't dug just anywhere. They were meticulously planned and positioned on a slightly elevated area of the landscape oriented with the cardinal directions, usually east-west. This wasn't accidental. It was part of a sophisticated plan to capture monsoon rainfall and water diverted from rivers and streams, storing it for use during the dry season. The sheer volume of earth moved to create the dikes for a brae like the West Brae, or the now dry East Brae, was immense, millions upon millions of cubic meters. Think about loading basket after basket, carrying it up the rising embankment day after day, year after year, generation after generation. Your Fitbit would explode. The primary practical purpose of these colossal structures was undeniably agricultural. Mainstream historical fact time, the braes were designed to provide reliable irrigation for the intensive cultivation of rice, particularly wet rice farming, which could yield multiple harvests per year in the tropical climate if water was available year-round. This was the engine of the empire. Rice was the currency, the food source, the foundation of their prosperity and ability to support a large population clustered around the capital area. The braes acted as massive buffer zones, holding water during the rainy season and releasing it through a network of canals and sluice gates to flood the rice fields during the dry months. It transformed the risky gamble of rain-fed agriculture into a predictable high-yield system. But it wasn't just about squirting water onto rice paddies. These braes served multiple functions. They regulated the groundwater table, preventing the land around the city from becoming waterlogged during the monsoon, and keeping wells supplied during the dry season. They were also important for transport, allowing boats to move goods and people within the capital region. And significantly, they were sources of fish, providing another vital food source for the population. Imagine fishing in a reservoir the size of a small sea, right outside your city walls. Talk about convenience. However, the braes were more than just giant watering cans and fish farms. This is where the quirky tidbit comes in. Many of the large braes had a temple, often built on an artificial island, right in their centre. Think of the East Mabon or West Mabon temples. These temples were typically dedicated to Hindu deities or represented elements of Hindu cosmology. The brae itself surrounding the temple was often seen as a representation of the cosmic ocean surrounding Mount Meru, the dwelling place of the gods. So while you were paddling across this vast reservoir, potentially with a basket of fish, you were also symbolically traversing the waters of the universe towards the sacred mountain at its centre. It's like your daily commute involving a brief, unintentional, cosmic journey. Gives spiritual detour a whole new meaning, doesn't it? This blending of the practical and the symbolic is one of the most fascinating aspects of Angkorian water management. Historians still argue whether the religious and political symbolism was the primary driver for the scale and layout of the braes, with agricultural benefits being a crucial but perhaps secondary outcome, or if the absolute necessity of feeding millions dictated the design, and the rulers then layered religious meaning onto it. Was the king building a cosmic landscape that also happened to feed everyone really well? Or was he building a super-efficient farm system and dressing it up with divine symbolism to look cool and legitimize his rule? It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, and the truth is likely a complex interplay of both. Building these braes required unimaginable labour and sophisticated planning. It wasn't just digging, it was engineering. They had to understand soil mechanics to build stable dikes, hydraulics to design sluices, and canals that could manage the flow of vast amounts of water, and surveying to ensure the reservoirs were level and the canals sloped correctly. This wasn't just manual labour, it was intelligent, organised, large-scale engineering. The rulers could mobilise tens, even hundreds of thousands of people for these projects. Imagine being drafted for the Royal Earth Moving Corps. Your job description: dig hole, carry dirt, repeat for 20 years, maybe get a fish. The success of this hydraulic system allowed the Angkorian population to swell, supporting cities that, at their peak, were among the largest in the world at the time. The reliable food surplus provided by the Berets was the foundation upon which the magnificent temples, the intricate art, and the complex administrative structure of the empire were built. It was the infrastructure that powered the Golden Age. It's easy to get lost in the stone carvings of Angkor Wat, but perhaps the most impressive monuments of all were these silent, vast bodies of water, reflecting the sky and feeding the empire beneath. You've got the image now, right? These enormous watery rectangles, shimmering under the tropical sun, the lifeblood of a civilization. It sounds idyllic, doesn't it? Like living next to your own personal kingdom-sized swimming pool. But here's the catch. Building something this massive is one challenge. Maintaining it, keeping it functional year after year, decade after decade, century after century, that's a whole different beast. Think about maintaining your own home. The roof leaks, the plumbing clogs, the paint peels. Now multiply that by 1 million square meters of earth and water. These Berets, these magnificent hydraulic engines, were incredibly demanding. They weren't like stone temples that once built largely stood on their own, though even temples needed upkeep, but that's another story for a different sleep session. The Berets were dynamic systems. The dikes were constantly subject to erosion from rain, wind, and the water itself. Sluice gates needed repair and replacement. Canals silted up and had to be dredged. It was a never-ending cycle of maintenance, a constant battle against entropy and the forces of nature. Imagine having dike patching listed as a permanent line item in the national budget. This wasn't just a few guys with shovels doing some weekend repairs. Mainstream historical fact time. The upkeep of the Angkorian hydraulic network, particularly the large Berets and the associated canals, required the continuous mobilization of vast amounts of labour. This wasn't a one-off construction project, it was a permanent state of vigilance and repair. Armies of workers were needed year-round to inspect the dikes for weak spots, haul earth to patch breaches, clear debris from canals, and maintain the complex system of gates that controlled water flow. If a dike failed during the monsoon, it could unleash a catastrophic flood on the fields and settlements below. If the canals leading from the Beret weren't kept clear, the stored water couldn't reach the crops during the dry season, leading to drought and famine. The margin for error was slim, and the consequences of neglect were dire. It was literally a matter of life and death for millions. No pressure. So, the same rulers who could command the building of Angkor Wat or the Bayon also had to be expert logistics managers, capable of organising tens of thousands of people not just for war or monumental construction, but for the grinding, essential work of infrastructure maintenance. Think of the planning involved, scheduling repairs, allocating resources, earth, timber, for gates, tools, feeding and housing the labour force, overseeing the quality of the work. It was ancient project management on a scale that would make a modern construction foreman weep into his coffee. You thought getting your team to finish their expense reports was tough. Try getting 50,000 people to properly compact clay on a mile-long embankment in 95-degree heat. Now for a quirky tidbit related to this never-ending task. While much of the labour was likely organised through a system of corvée, a form of mandatory labour service owed to the state or ruler, there are suggestions in inscriptions that specialised groups or villages might have been permanently assigned specific maintenance duties. Imagine growing up knowing your family's destiny for generations was to maintain a particular section of a dike or a specific canal. It's like your family business is guardians of the sluice gate. Oh yeah, the Johnsons. They're the guys who keep that big wooden thing working, been doing it for 300 years. It gives a whole new meaning to job security, doesn't it? And possibly chronic back pain. The political implications of this maintenance were huge. A ruler's shaldub and ability to keep the water system functioning directly impacted the prosperity and stability of the empire. If the braes and canals worked, there was food, the population was content, relatively speaking, and the king looked like he had the divine favour necessary to ensure abundance. If the system failed, whether due to neglect, poor planning, or natural disaster, it could lead to unrest, loss of legitimacy for the ruler, and potentially the empire's decline. This dependency on the hydraulic network meant that controlling the water was as important as controlling the land or the army. Historians still argue whether the sheer scale and complexity of this system ultimately became a liability. Was the system inherently fragile, requiring perfect management and constant inputs of labour and resources? Or was it robust and resilient, capable of withstanding shocks as long as the core political structure remained stable enough to organise the necessary maintenance? Some scholars point to periods of apparent decline in the hydraulic system, coinciding with political instability or external pressures, suggesting a direct link. Others argue that the system was remarkably well designed, and that its eventual decline was a symptom of deeper problems rather than a primary cause. It's like asking if your car breaking down caused your bad day, or if your bad day and neglect caused your car to break down. Probably a bit of both, wouldn't you say? Think about the knowledge required to manage this system. It wasn't just brute force, it involved understanding the flow of rivers, the patterns of the monsoon, the permeability of different soils, the structural properties of timber for gates, the right times of year for dredging or repair work. This knowledge had to be accumulated, passed down, and applied systematically across a vast territory. There must have been a class of engineers, supervisors, and administrators dedicated solely to the operation and maintenance of the hydraulic network. They were the unsung heroes, the plumbers and earth movers of the Angkorian world. While everyone else was building stunning temples, these guys were ankle-deep in mud, making sure the rice fields wouldn't dry up. Not as glamorous perhaps, but arguably more essential for the average person's survival. So the next time you see pictures of Angkor Wat shimmering reflected in the moat, which, remember, is also part of this vast water system, spare a thought for the millions of hours of labour that went into not just building these structures, but keeping the entire hydraulic machine running. It was a civilization built on water, yes, but sustained by mud and sweat and the relentless back-breaking work of maintenance crews who kept the dikes high and the canals clear. Their legacy isn't just the temples, it's the invisible infrastructure that made it all possible. And that work never, ever stopped. So you've grasped the sheer bone-aching effort that went into keeping the water flowing for the rice fields. The constant repair, the endless dredging, the battle against nature's persistent efforts to turn your beautifully engineered system back into swamp or dust. It was a monumental, practical undertaking, absolutely crucial for feeding the population and powering the economy. But to think that was the only reason these enormous water features existed would be missing a huge piece of the picture. Water in the Khmer Empire was far more than just irrigation juice. It was woven into the very fabric of their religion, their society and their daily lives in ways that might seem, well, a bit extra from our modern, purely utilitarian perspective. For a civilization deeply influenced by Hindu and later Buddhist cosmology, water held immense symbolic power. In Hindu belief, the universe is often depicted with cosmic mountains surrounded by vast oceans. The Angkorian temples, built as representations of cosmic mountains, like Mount Meru, were frequently surrounded by moats. These weren't just defensive features, although they served that purpose too. They were symbolic oceans, turning the temple mountain into an island at the centre of the universe. Walking towards a temple across its causeway, you were symbolically journeying from the mundane world across the cosmic ocean to the sacred realm. And the bares, those city-sized reservoirs, they weren't just pragmatic storage tanks. Many scholars believe they also represented these cosmic oceans. Imagine looking out across the West Baray, a body of water 8 kilometres long and over 2 kilometres wide. It's vast, horizon spanning. It absolutely feels like an ocean, albeit a very calm man-made one. This blending of the practical and the symbolic is typical of Angkorian engineering and architecture. They built things that worked incredibly well, but they also imbued them with deep spiritual meaning. It's like designing a public park that also happens to be a giant mandala. Why just have a pond when you can have a sacred sea? Water was also central to rituals and purification. Bathing was important not just for hygiene, though I imagine that was appreciated in the tropical heat, but also for spiritual cleansing. Temple complexes often included pools or tanks for ritual washing. Inscriptions mention ceremonies involving sacred water. The ruling elite likely had engaged in elaborate bathing rituals, perhaps in private pools or within the temple precincts, further connecting water to divine power and royal authority. Access to clean water, and the ability to use it for purification, was intertwined with religious devotion and social status. Imagine your neighbourhood having fountains not just for decoration, but because dipping your hands in is part of your morning prayers. Mainstream historical fact time. The design of Angkorian cities and temples reflects a deliberate integration of water features, including moats, reservoirs, barrays, and sophisticated drainage systems, not just for practical purposes like flood control and irrigation, but also for symbolic representation and ritual use, particularly in relation to Hindu cosmology and the concept of the temple mountain surrounded by an ocean. This isn't just about pipes and pumps, it's about faith and world building, literally. The city of Angkor Thom, built by Jayavarman VII, is perhaps the ultimate example of this integration. Surrounded by a massive moat, its various temples and causeways are interwoven with smaller pools and water channels. The central temple, the Bayon, with its enigmatic faces, sits at the heart of this water-laced cosmic diagram. Even outside the main temple complexes, water features were important. Villages would have ponds, sometimes sacred, sometimes purely practical for daily use, washing clothes, collecting drinking water, giving the local water buffalo a place to cool off. And yes, I'm sure there were jokes about sharing your bathwater with a bovine back then, just like there are now. Here's a quirky tidbit that highlights the less obvious uses. Some researchers propose that the berets also served a psychological or aesthetic purpose. Imagine the psychological impact of having such a massive, calm body of water near your city, especially during the harsh dry season when the landscape turns brown and dusty. It would have been a constant visual reminder of the king's power to control nature, to bring life and abundance to the land. It offered relief from the heat, a place for reflection, perhaps even leisure for the elite. It wasn't just a stray bag, it was a statement piece, a symbol of prosperity and divine favour. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of having a massive infinity pool that also happens to feed your entire population. The scale of the berets relative to the urban areas themselves is also striking. The West Beret is much larger than the walled city of Angkor Thom. This has led to an open scholarly debate whether the primary motivation for their construction was purely agricultural, primarily symbolic and religious, or a complex combination of both. Did they build these giant oceans because they needed the water for rice and layered the symbolism on top? Or were the cosmic symbolism and ritual uses the main drivers, with the irrigation benefits being a happy or perhaps planned side effect? It's tough to definitively separate the sacred from the practical in this period, as they were often deeply intertwined in Khmer culture. Was the king building a granary or a gateway to the divine? Probably both, just to keep everyone, mortal and immortal, happy. This deep connection between water, religion and society is reflected in inscriptions that praise kings for bringing water to the land and for building reservoirs. It was seen as a benevolent, even divine act. A king who could command the elements, tame the floods of the monsoon and store water for the dry season was a powerful and legitimate ruler. His ability to provide water for crops, purification and potentially even aesthetic pleasure reinforced his position at the centre of the cosmic and social order. So while the image of endless maintenance crews patching dikes is certainly accurate and essential, remember the other side of the coin. The water they were managing wasn't just H2O, it was sacred cosmic ocean, purifying element, symbol of royal power, and a source of life that connected the people to their rulers, their gods, and the very structure of the universe. It was a truly holistic approach to liquid management, far beyond just turning on a tap. So you've got this picture now of water not just as a utility, but as this almost sacred, cosmic force, right? Flowing through the universe, purifying, central to royal power, a literal ocean surrounding your symbolic temple mountain. Pretty deep stuff, but translating that spiritual significance into reality, into those absolutely enormous city-sized berets we've been talking about, that took something else entirely. That took dirt, lots and lots of dirt, and people, lots and lots of people, and time, an almost unbelievable amount of time and relentless effort. Imagine, if you can, standing at the edge of something like the West Beret today. It's not a natural lake. It's a rectangle, 8 kilometres long, just over 2 kilometres wide, perfectly aligned on an east-west axis, and it's held into place by massive earthen walls. These walls are substantial. We're talking about dikes that rise several metres above the surrounding ground, thick and solid. To build just one of these behemoths, they didn't have bulldozers, they didn't have excavators, they didn't have dump trucks. They had baskets, they had shovels made of wood or maybe a bit of iron if you were lucky. They had their own backs and their own hands. The sheer volume of earth moved for these projects is staggering. Estimates vary depending on the specific beret, but we're talking millions, maybe even tens of millions, of cubic meters of soil and clay. Think about your backyard. Maybe you dug a hole for a tree. Now imagine digging a hole the size of a small city block several meters deep, just using a shovel and a basket. Now multiply that by the area of the West Beret, which is 16 square kilometers. It's a scale of excavation and construction that is almost impossible for us to comprehend in an age of heavy machinery. It makes digging the Panama Canal look like building a sandcastle, almost. To build the dikes, they had to excavate the material from the basin itself, or perhaps from borrow pits nearby, and then carry it, scoop by scoop, basket by basket, to build up these enormous walls. They had to compass them, packed the earth as they went, layer by layer, to make sure the dikes were strong enough to hold back the immense weight of the water when the monsoon rains arrived. This wasn't just piling dirt. It was a complex, carefully managed process of earth moving and construction that required skill, precision, and incredible discipline. You can't just wing it when you're building a wall to hold back an inland sea. One weak spot, one area not compacted properly, and the whole thing could fail catastrophically during the flood season. Mainstream historical fact check: the West Barre alone contains an estimated 10 to 15 million cubic meters of earth in its dikes, a volume that would take modern machinery years to move, let alone ancient tools and human labour. This wasn't just a big project, it was a nation-defining effort. This level of construction demanded an enormous workforce. We're talking thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of labourers working continuously for years, sometimes decades on a single barre. Who were these people? Well, likely a combination of conscripted labour, corvée, perhaps prisoners of war, and possibly free labourers compelled to work for the state as part of their civic duty or tax obligations. It wasn't a 9-to-5 job with union breaks. It was hard, hot, back-breaking work under the tropical sun, probably overseen by foremen and engineers. Imagine the sheer logistics of feeding, housing, and managing such a massive workforce in ancient times, without instant communication or paved roads. Just getting enough food and water to everyone would have been a monumental task in itself. You'd need an army of caterers just to keep the earth movers going. The tools were basic: wood, bamboo, simple metal implements. Baskets woven from plant fibres were essential for carrying earth. Simple levers and ramps might have been used to lift heavier materials, but for the most part it was muscle power. Oxen or elephants might have helped with some hauling or compacting, but the fine work, the shaping of the dikes, the constant back and forth carrying, that was all human. It's a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance, but also perhaps to the coercive power of the state. People didn't just decide to build something this big. They were organised, directed, and likely compelled to do it. Here's a quirky tidbit about the process. Evidence from excavations and surveys suggests the Khmer engineers were incredibly skilled at levelling. They needed to ensure the bottom and valve of the barre was relatively flat to allow for efficient water storage and distribution, and that the tops of the dikes were at a consistent level. They likely used simple water levelling techniques, perhaps involving water-filled troughs or tubes similar to how ancient Romans or Egyptians achieved precise gradients. Imagine setting up a primitive water level across kilometres of uneven terrain in the sweltering heat. Not exactly a quick job. They had to be meticulous surveyors even with basic tech. The engineering wasn't just about moving dirt, it was also about managing water during construction. How do you build a dike in an area that floods during the monsoon? You likely had to build sections during the dry season, perhaps diverting water, and reinforce them against the coming rains, hoping they held. It was a constant battle against the very element you were trying to harness, and once built, these dikes weren't maintenance-free. Rivers constantly carried silt threatening to fill the barres. The dikes themselves were susceptible to erosion, animal burrowing, imagine a particularly ambitious badger, Khmer style, and structural stresses. This brings up an open, scholarly debate. How voluntary or coercive was the labour used for these projects? While some scholars emphasise the religious devotion and civic pride that might have motivated people to work on projects for the king and temples, others point to the scale and hardship of the labour as evidence of a more coercive system where people were forced to contribute their labour under threat of punishment. Was it a grand community effort or state-imposed hardship? Or most likely a bit of both, varying over time and place. It's hard to know exactly how happy those basket-carrying folks were about their job description. Earth-moving specialist probably wasn't high on the desired career list. Building these barres wasn't just an engineering feat. It was a social and political one. It required a highly organised society, capable of mobilising vast resources and controlling tens of thousands of people. The king, as the divine ruler and central authority, was the driving force behind these projects. Their construction solidified his power and legitimacy, demonstrating his ability to command labour and resources on an unprecedented scale, all in the name of providing for his people and maybe impressing the gods. It was infrastructure development as political theatre. So next time you look at a picture of a serene barre near Angkor Wat, don't just see a tranquil lake. See the ghosts of thousands of labourers sweating under the sun, carrying baskets of earth, building these massive structures by hand. See the ancient engineers puzzling over levels and compaction. See the immense power of a state capable of orchestrating such an effort. It wasn't just dirt and water, it was the physical manifestation of an empire's ambition, its faith, and its sheer, relentless hard work. So you've got the picture now of mountains of earth being moved, right? Baskets swinging, dust rising, the sheer muscle and manpower involved in building those colossal dikes. But all that sweat and strain, all that raw effort, wouldn't have amounted to much more than a giant, messy hole into the ground if it wasn't guided by some serious intelligence. This wasn't just about being able to lift heavy things, it was about understanding how water behaves. It was about ancient Khmer engineering genius, even if they didn't call it that. They just called it getting the water to go where they wanted it to go, which, let's be honest, is still the goal of most engineering today, just with more lasers and hard hats. Imagine trying to design something that holds back an amount of water that could fill a couple of major cities, using only natural materials and a relatively simple toolkit. You need to understand pressure, you need to understand compaction, you need to understand critically how to make water flow uphill relative to where it came from initially, or at least how to lift it or store it at a higher elevation so it can flow downhill later to the thirsty fields. This wasn't intuitive stuff you just picked up on the fly. This required observation, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. Their understanding of hydraulics, while perhaps not expressed in fancy equations like ours, was deeply practical. They knew that water flows downhill, obviously, but they also knew how to control that flow. They knew how to build channels with incredibly subtle gradients, slopes so gentle you wouldn't even notice them walking along the bottom, yet just enough to keep water moving slowly but surely over kilometres and kilometres. Getting that gradient right was crucial. Too steep, and the water rushes, eroding the banks and silting up the channel. Too flat, and it just sits there, stagnating or refusing to flow at all. Its Goldilocks engineering has to be just right, and achieving that just right over vast distances with basic levelling tools, that's where the genius comes in. Mainstream historical fact check. Some of the main canals radiating from the Berais maintain a gradient of less than 10 centimetres per kilometre. That's effectively flat to the naked eye, but is precisely calibrated to ensure steady water flow without causing excessive erosion or stagnation. Try pouring water on your slightly tilted kitchen counter and see how fast it goes. Now imagine controlling that over miles. How did they achieve this precision? We talked briefly about water levels. Imagine using a long, straight piece of wood with a trough carved into the top filled with water. By sighting along the surface of the water in the trough, which always seeks its own level, you could establish a horizontal line. Then, by carefully measuring drops or rises relative to that line using ropes, plumb bobs and markers, you could lay out a gradient. It would be slow, painstaking work, probably done in stages across the landscape. You'd set up a level point, measure down a tiny bit, mark it, move the level, and repeat. Kilometres of this inch by inch, or rather cubit by cubit. You'd need immense patience, keen eyes, and probably a good hat to keep the sun off. They also had to understand soil mechanics. Those massive dikes holding back the Berais weren't just piles of dirt. They were engineered structures. The material had to be carefully selected, likely to mixed of clay and earth that would compact well and be relatively impermeable. They knew they had to build in layers, compacting each layer thoroughly before adding the next. This wasn't just about making it solid, it was about preventing seepage and structural failure. Imagine the trial and error involved in figuring that out before modern soil science existed. This dirt just leaks. Let's try the stuff near the riverbank instead. Probably lots of spectacular failures early on. Beyond the Berais and main canals, there was a whole network of smaller channels, ditches, and field boundaries. This was the capillary system, taking water from the main arteries and distributing it directly to the rice paddies. This micro-level management required understanding the subtle contours of the land, how water spread out, and how to control flow into and out of individual fields. It was agriculture meeting engineering on a very intimate scale, like a vast, ancient sprinkler system, but powered by gravity and patience. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some evidence suggests they might have used natural indicators in the landscape to help with their engineering. Certain plants grow only where the water table is high. Certain geological formations indicate stable ground, and the natural flow of streams during the dry season would give clues about the minimum water levels. They were likely keen observers of their environment, integrating that traditional ecological knowledge with their technical skills. It wasn't just blueprints, it was also reading the landscape itself. This intricate understanding raises an open scholarly debate. To what extent did the Khmer engineers develop sophisticated theoretical models of hydraulics, or was their success primarily the result of empirical knowledge gained through generations of trial and error and practical experience? Did they have textbooks of engineering principles, perhaps written on palm leaves, or was it mostly a master-apprentice system of passing down hands-on skills? It's a bit like asking if a master blacksmith understood metallurgy scientifically, or just knew from experience how to work the metal. Probably a blend, leaning heavily on practical know-how. The control structures were also key. Simple sluice gates, likely made of wood or stone, were used to regulate the flow of water into and out of the braes and canals. Imagine heavy timbers or stone slabs that could be lowered or raised to open or close channels. These needed to be robust enough to withstand the pressure of moving water, yet simple enough to operate and maintain. They weren't fancy automated valves, but they were the effective bottlenecks in a vast system, allowing for precise control over distribution. Getting stuck trying to manually open a massive wooden sluice gate during a sudden downpour. Not exactly the glamorous side of ancient engineering. So, when you picture these vast barrays, don't just think of the digging. Think of the careful planning, the meticulous surveying, the understanding of materials, the clever use of gravity, and the design of complex networks. Think of the ancient engineers, probably squinting under the sun, arguing about gradients, perhaps using simple tools to measure angles and distances, solving problems that would stump many of us today without our calculators and laser levels. It was a quieter, slower form of innovation, built on observation and persistence, allowing them to bend one of nature's most powerful forces, water, to their will, literally changing the landscape to feed an empire. Okay, so you've got the scale, you've got the intent, you've got the fundamental cleverness of wanting to harness water, but wanting it and actually doing it are two very different things, especially when you're trying to manage lakes worth of water with the tools and knowledge base of the 12th century. They weren't just digging holes and hoping for the best. They were facing some serious engineering nightmares, problems that still keep modern engineers up at night, albeit with different technology. Think about the pressure. Imagine a wall of water, kilometers long and potentially several meters deep. That water is constantly pushing outwards, trying to escape. The dikes holding it in weren't made of reinforced concrete and steel. They were made of dirt, mud, and whatever natural materials they could find. The sheer hydrostatic pressure would have been immense. Building a dike that could withstand that pressure, year after year, through monsoon floods and dry season lows, without collapsing or simply washing away, was a monumental task. It's like trying to hold back a bathtub full of water with just a pile of sand, but the bathtub is the size of a small country. Then there was seepage. Water is annoyingly good at finding the path of least resistance, and it loves to sneak through cracks and pores. If their dikes weren't built just right, with carefully selected and compacted materials, water would constantly seep through the embankment, weakening the structure, potentially leading to catastrophic failures. A slow leak might seem minor, but over time, under immense pressure, it can erode the internal structure of the dike like a persistent little water-based saboteur. Trying to stop seepage in something the size of a city perimeter wall without modern sealants or heavy machinery? That would have been a constant battle, probably involving lots of mudslinging, literally. Their solution? Well, archaeology gives us clues. They built those dikes in layers, as we touched on, but it wasn't just layering, it was careful layering with intensive compaction. Think human-powered steamrollers. Workers likely used heavy wooden tampers or even their own feet. Ouch, imagine the blisters, to pack the earth down as tightly as possible. They also likely selected specific types of soil. Clay-rich soil, when wet and then compacted, becomes relatively impermeable, creating a natural barrier. So they weren't just using any dirt, they were selecting the right dirt, probably hauling it from specific locations, which added another layer of logistical complexity. Mainstream historical fact check, archaeological cross-sections of the Barre dikes show distinct layers of soil and fill material, often with evidence of intense compaction. Some dikes also appear to have had core structures potentially using different, more impermeable materials within the main body of the embankment to further reduce seepage. Erosion was another enemy. Not just the water pushing outwards, but the water flowing through the canals. Even with those gentle gradients, moving water carries sediment, and over time it can wear away at the banks and the bottom of the channels. And in reverse, silt from the rivers and runoff would constantly be trying to fill up the canals and barrays. Siltation is the bane of any water management system, ancient or modern. It's like trying to keep your gutters clear during autumn, but on an empire-wide scale and without a handy telescoping rake. How did they fight erosion and silt? The precise gradients we mentioned before were key. Slower flow equals less erosion. For siltation, there wasn't really a way to prevent it entirely. It was an ongoing maintenance issue. Imagine thousands of workers, year after year, manually dredging the canals and barrays, scooping out mud and sediment with baskets and shovels. It's the kind of job that makes modern road repair look like a spa day. This suggests a massive organised labour force dedicated purely to system maintenance, perhaps seen as a public duty or even a religious offering. You thought your civic duty was jury duty? Try annual barray dredging, a quirky tidbit. There's speculation that certain types of aquatic plants or specific methods of bank reinforcement using vegetation might have been employed in some parts of the system to help stabilise canal banks and reduce erosion naturally. While direct evidence is scarce, many traditional irrigation systems around the world utilise natural methods like planting specific grasses or reeds along edges. It's possible the Khmer did too, adding a touch of green thumbs to their grey engineering. Then there was the sheer complexity of the network. Managing the flow through dozens or hundreds of kilometres of channels, ensuring water reached the right fields at the right time required constant monitoring and adjustment of the sluice gates. It wasn't a set-it-and-forget-it system. Water levels changed with the seasons, rainfall varied year to year, and demand fluctuated depending on the rice cycle. This required a sophisticated understanding of the system as a whole, not just individual components. It was ancient network administration, but instead of fixing a server, you were unblocking a channel. This leads to an open scholarly debate. Was the eventual decline or collapse of the Khmer Empire's hydraulic system primarily due to inherent engineering flaws that couldn't cope with environmental pressures, like climate shifts or increased siltation? Or was it more a consequence of socio-political factors disrupting the massive labour force and centralised control needed for constant maintenance? Or was it, most likely, a complex interplay of both? It's the classic chicken or egg problem of history. Did the system fail and weaken the empire? Or did the empire weaken and fail to maintain the system? Think about the resources needed just for upkeep. Not just the manual labour for dredging and repairs, but the organisational structure to direct that labour, the logistics to feed and house them, the knowledge transmission to train new workers and engineers. It was a continuous, gargantuan effort. And any disruption, war, famine, disease, or political instability could cripple the system by pulling away the essential maintenance crews. Like your home's plumbing, ignore a small leak or a slow drain for too long, and eventually you're going to have a much bigger, more expensive problem. So when you look at the remnants of these barrays and canals today, try to see beyond the quiet, tree-lined banks. Imagine the constant struggle against nature's forces, the relentless push of water pressure, the insidious work of seepage, the slow but steady choke of silt, the wearing away of earth by flow. Imagine the ingenuity applied to select soils, compact layers, design subtle gradients, and build simple but effective control gates. And imagine the endless back-breaking labour of maintenance. It wasn't just building a wonder, it was fighting a continuous war to keep it functioning. And that fight required not just brilliant minds, but millions of hands and a stable society to organise them. The engineering was impressive, but the logistics of keeping it running might have been the real marvel, and potentially the Achilles heel. So you've wrestled with the sheer engineering headache. You've imagined the endless, back-breaking labour just to keep the system from falling apart, battling against pressure, seepage, and the relentless tide of silt. You might be thinking, okay, I get it. They needed a lot of water for rice, and this was their supersized solution. And yes, that's a huge part of the story. Feeding an empire requires serious planning and infrastructure. But was that all of it? Was it purely a utilitarian exercise in agricultural output? Look again at the scale, the almost absurd size of these artificial lakes. The West Baray covering over 600 hectares, the East Baray now mostly dry, even larger in its day. These aren't just big ponds, they're inland seas, and they were built not just near fields, but often right next to the capital cities, sometimes even incorporated into the city's layout. If it was only about irrigation, surely smaller, more numerous reservoirs scattered throughout the agricultural heartland would have been more efficient for water delivery. Hauling water kilometres across the landscape via canals loses a lot of volume and efficiency. So why concentrate these massive water bodies right at the centre of power? This is where you start to step beyond the purely practical and into the realm of the symbolic, the spiritual, the utterly mind-bending cosmology of the Khmer Empire. For the rulers and the people, these berets were far more than just giant water tanks. They were reflections of the cosmos itself, sacred landscapes engineered into reality. Think about the prevailing belief systems. Hinduism and later Mahayana Buddhism were deeply intertwined with Khmer kingship and the structure of the universe. In Hindu cosmology, the world is centered around Mount Meru, the home of the gods, surrounded by rings of continents and oceans. The capital city, especially Angkor, was often conceived as a microcosm of this cosmic order. The central temples, like Angkor Wat or the Bayon, represented Mount Meru. And guess what those massive berets often represented? The cosmic oceans, Sagara, surrounding the sacred mountain. You can almost picture it. The king residing in his palace near the central temple, Meru, looking out over the vast expanse of the Barae, Sagara. It wasn't just a view, it was a declaration. I, the king, control the cosmic ocean just as the gods control the universe. Building and maintaining these immense water bodies was a demonstration of divine favour and immense power, a physical manifestation of the king's mandate to bring order and prosperity to the world. It was hydraulic engineering meets divine theatre, like building a massive, functional swimming pool shaped like your national symbol, but, way more spiritual and less likely to have inflatable flamingos. Mainstream historical fact check. Many of the major temples at Angkor, particularly the state temples built by powerful kings, are deliberately located relative to large berets, often positioned as a mountain arising from the ocean, aligning with cosmic symbolism. For example, the Eastern Mebon Temple sits on an island in the now dry East Beret. The water itself held a deep symbolic meaning. Water is life, purity, fertility. In many cosmologies, water is the primordial element, the source from which creation emerges. By controlling vast quantities of water, the Khmer kings weren't just ensuring good harvests, they were symbolically tapping into the very forces of creation and fertility, ensuring the prosperity of the land and the people through divine connection. Imagine explaining that to a modern investor. Yes, our ROI is excellent, but also we're manifesting the cosmic ocean. Might be a tough pitch. There's even a quirky tidbit that suggests some Bares had islands built in their centres, often topped with temples or shrines. These islands, like the Eastern Mabon or the Temple of Neek Peen, which was specifically designed as a medical sanctuary with water features linked to the mythical Anavatapta Lake, weren't practical for irrigation distribution. Their sole purpose seems to have been religious or symbolic, a sacred space rising from the cosmic waters. It's like putting a tiny chapel in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. You're clearly not going there for easy access to fishing spots. This dual function, practical irrigation and profound symbolism, leads directly to an open scholarly debate. Which was the primary driver for constructing these immense berets? Were they primarily built as essential irrigation infrastructure, with their cosmological and symbolic aspects being a beneficial bonus that reinforced royal authority? Or were they first and foremost symbolic landscapes, essential to the king's divine mandate and the kingdom's cosmic alignment, with the irrigation benefits being a valuable secondary function? It's hard to untangle, like trying to figure out if a wedding cake is primarily about feeding people or symbolizing eternal sweetness. Probably both, right? Perhaps that the scale was necessary for both. To represent the cosmic ocean convincingly, it needed to be vast. A small pond just wouldn't cut it for a universe-spanning symbol. And once you have a water body that large, even if its primary purpose was symbolic, it would be incredibly wasteful not to use it for irrigation as well. It becomes a powerful feedback loop. The king's cosmic control brings literal fertility to the land through irrigation, reinforcing the belief in his divine power. This intertwining of the practical and the symbolic meant the berets were central to royal power and religious practice. Processions might have taken place on or around them. Water from the berets might have been used in rituals. The very act of organising the hundreds of thousands of people required to build these structures was a display of absolute royal command, a testament to the king's ability to marshal the resources of the entire empire for monumental tasks, pleasing both the gods and the people, hopefully. It was state-building, hydraulic engineering and spiritual theatre all rolled into one incredibly ambitious, incredibly wet package. So, as you drift deeper into the idea of these ancient reservoirs, try to see past the image of just digging a big hole. See the reflection of the heavens in the water. See the cosmic order laid out on the earth. See the king demonstrating his divine right not just through temples, but through the sheer controlled power of water. It was a monumental task driven by needs both earthly and divine, a landscape designed not just to feed bodies, but to nourish souls and solidify the power of rulers who literally tried to hold the universe in their hands, or at least in their giant berets. You've let the idea of the cosmic ocean wash over you, the symbolism, the sheer audacious declaration of divine power reflected in these enormous man-made lakes. But okay, setting aside the spiritual real estate development for a second, how did these things actually work? How did they get water in, keep it there, and then get it out to where it was needed? Which, remember, was the crucial part for feeding all those people. Think of the berets as giant, slightly leaky bathtubs in the landscape. The water didn't just magically appear, it had to be captured. The primary source was the monsoon rains, which dump incredible amounts of water on the region during the wet season, roughly from May to October. But relying solely on direct rainfall into the basin would be inefficient and wouldn't capture the runoff from the wider catchment area. So the system also relied on diverting water from rivers and streams. The main rivers in the Angkor region, like the Siem Reap River, would swell dramatically during the monsoon. The Khmer engineers built sophisticated weirs and intake canals to channel this water into the berets. Imagine temporary dams or carefully angled diversions directing a portion of the river's flow into a purpose-built channel that snaked its way towards the beret. It wasn't just a simple ditch. These feeder canals were designed to carry a significant volume of water without eroding their banks excessively. You can picture the muddy water, thick with sediment from the flooded rivers, churning its way towards the vast empty basin, slowly starting to fill it like some ancient colossal water balloon. The basins themselves were enclosed by massive earthen dikes. Building these dikes was an epic undertaking, essentially creating artificial hills kilometers long and many meters high and wide. They were often faced with laterite or stone in crucial areas, especially around the intake and outflow points, but the bulk was just piled up earth, rammed solid by countless hands and feet. Holding back such an immense volume of water with just packed dirt and some stone facing is impressive. It requires constant maintenance, like trying to keep a sandcastle perfect during high tide. Any weak point, any burrowing animal, maybe a really determined ancient otter, any slight erosion, and you've got a potential breach on your hands. The pressure at the base of these dikes must have been immense. You can almost hear the earth groaning under the strain. The beauty of these massive reservoirs was their storage capacity. The monsoon is great, but it doesn't last forever. The dry season in Cambodia is long and hot from November to April, with hardly any rain. The berets acted as giant buffers, capturing the wet season bounty and holding it in reserve for the crucial period when the Gil rice paddies needed water the most. This allowed for multiple rice harvests per year in areas that might otherwise only manage one or two, dramatically increasing agricultural output and supporting that huge population at Angkor. It was like having a vast, ancient savings account of water, ready to be withdrawn when times got dry. Much more reliable than burying coins, though arguably harder to hide from your neighbours. Getting the water out for irrigation was done primarily through a network of canals fed by outflow channels from the berets. These channels were controlled by sluice gates. This is a mainstream historical fact. Stone or brick-lined sluice gates with grooves for wooden planks have been found at the outlets of berets and along the main canals, demonstrating a precise control over water flow. You could raise or lower the planks to regulate how much water was released and when. Imagine the engineers standing there adjusting the flow, making crucial decisions about water distribution that could mean the difference between a bumper crop and widespread hunger. It's a level of infrastructure control that feels surprisingly modern. From the main outflow channels, a hierarchical network of smaller canals branched out, snaking across the agricultural lands. The land around Angkor gently slopes away from the berets and the central city area. This natural gradient was key. The entire irrigation system was largely gravity-fed. You opened the gates at the beret, and thus the water simply flowed downhill through the network of canals to the fields. No pumps needed, no complex machinery, just clever use of topography and meticulous digging. It's elegant in its simplicity, but mind-boggling in its scale. like building a giant waterslide system for your farm, but deadly serious and less fun. A quirky tidbit about the canal system. Archaeologists have noted that the canals were often dug with slightly convex bottoms, and in some cases, the main feeder canals entering or leaving the Barrays were angled slightly off perpendicular to the dike. This wasn't just sloppy work. These subtle design features likely helped to slow the water flow, encourage sedimentation within the canal system where it could potentially be managed, and distribute nutrient-rich silt onto the fields during controlled flooding, rather than letting it all pile up at the Barray entrance or blast through the system, eroding everything. It was a form of ancient, subtle hydraulic fine-tuning. Despite the evidence of sophisticated design and monumental effort, there's still an open, scholarly debate about the overall efficiency and integration of the entire Khmer hydraulic network. Historians still argue whether the system was a single, centrally planned, monolithic entity directed from Angkor, or if it was a more modular, organically grown collection of interconnected subsystems added and modified over centuries by different kings and local communities. Was there a grand master plan from day one, or did it evolve more like a complex, sprawling network of canals, with bits added here and there as needed, sometimes fitting perfectly, sometimes requiring a bit of a workaround? Regardless of the exact level of central planning, the system worked well enough for centuries to support millions of people and allow for the construction of the breathtaking temples that survive today. It wasn't perfect, of course. Siltation was a constant enemy, requiring endless dredging. Dikes needed repair, and the system was incredibly vulnerable to disruption, whether from warfare, internal strife, or environmental changes, but for its time, and arguably for many centuries thereafter, it was an unparalleled feat of hydraulic engineering, a testament to human ingenuity, organization, and a desperate, vital need for water. It was the engine room of the empire, hidden in plain sight, often just a muddy ditch or a grassy embankment, but more powerful in its way than any stone temple. So you've got these incredible systems, these vast pools and networks of channels, capturing and distributing water with surprising sophistication, mostly just by letting gravity do its thing down carefully dug slopes. But this wasn't just about hydrology, it was profoundly about power. Think about it. Who controls the tap? Who decides who gets water, when, and how much? In a society utterly dependent on irrigated rice for survival, controlling the water was the ultimate power move. Imagine you're a farmer, living out in the plains surrounding Angkor, your entire family's well-being resting on the success of your rice crop. The dry season is baking the earth, cracks appearing in the ground, and your paddies are turning dusty brown. The rain is months away. Your only hope is that crucial release of water from the Barray, channeled down to your fields. And who holds the keys to that system? The king. His officials manage the sluice gates. They oversee the canal network, they dictate the schedule. Your life, quite literally, is in their hands, dependent on their good favour, or at least their efficient administration. This control wasn't subtle. It was the bedrock of the social hierarchy. At the top was the king, often seen as a divine figure, a sort of earthly manager for the cosmic water flow that sustained the world. Below him were the elites, the mandarins and priests who helped manage the complex affairs of the state, including this enormous hydraulic infrastructure. And at the bottom were the millions of farmers whose labour built and maintained the system, and whose lives were sustained by its output, but who were also utterly beholden to it. It's like living in a desert town where one guy owns the only well. You're probably going to be pretty polite to that guy, right? The sheer scale of the labour required to build and maintain the barrays and canals was staggering. This is a mainstream historical fact. Tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of people would have been conscripted or organised for these massive earth-moving projects. Imagine the scene. Vast numbers of people, probably working in shifts, digging with simple tools, carrying baskets of earth on their shoulders, pounding the soil to build those huge dikes. It wasn't glamorous temple building. This was hot, back-breaking work, essential infrastructure development on an epic scale. And the ability to mobilise and command such a massive workforce for generations was itself a potent symbol and instrument of royal power. It demonstrated the king's authority and capacity to organise society for monumental tasks. You couldn't just decide you didn't feel like carrying dirt that day. This was likely compulsory labour, a form of tax or duty owed to the state and the divine king. A little like when your neighbours announce a working bee and you conveniently remember you have that thing scheduled, but scaled up to empire levels with significantly higher stakes if you forget your appointment with a shovel. Beyond the practical control, the berets and the hydraulic system likely served a powerful ideological purpose. We talked about the cosmic ocean symbolism, how the berets mirrored mythical landscapes. But the control of water was also a tangible manifestation of the king's ability to ensure prosperity and fertility. He wasn't just ruling people, he was managing the very resources that sustained life, much like the gods were thought to manage the cosmic forces. A king who could provide abundant water for irrigation was seen as a legitimate, powerful ruler, blessed by the deities and capable of ensuring the welfare of his people. A king who couldn't, or whose system failed, might face unrest or lose legitimacy. It turns out managing complex infrastructure is just as stressful now as it was then. Imagine the Yelp reviews if the irrigation system broke down. 1 star, water was late, my crops died. Also, the divine king seemed stressed. There's a quirky tidbit about the local level. While the main system was centrally controlled, there's evidence that at the village level, communities had traditional water sharing arrangements, and local officials or elders might have played a role in the final distribution from the smaller canals to individual fields. So it wasn't necessarily a pure top-down dictatorship of water flow. There was probably a complex interplay between central command and local custom, a negotiation of power and resources at various scales. It adds a layer of human messiness to the grand, engineered landscape. Like your neighbourhood HOA rules about garden hoses, but life or death stakes. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for building the expansive hydraulic system was purely to maximise rice production and economic surplus, or if the system's main purpose was always intrinsically linked to the assertion and maintenance of political power and social control. Was it an incredibly ambitious public works project driven by practical necessity and a desire for wealth? Or was it primarily a tool for the elite to consolidate power, mobilise labour, and legitimise their rule through divine association and resource control? It's probably a bit of both, as most complex human endeavours are, but where the emphasis lay is still debated. Did they build it because they had to feed everyone, or because it let them control everyone they were feeding? A chicken or egg question with really muddy consequences. Walking along the top of one of these ancient dikes today, seeing the vast expanse where water once lay, you can almost feel the weight of that history, the power dynamics embedded in the earth itself. The quiet hum of insects replaces the shouts of labour, the gentle rustle of grass replaces the splash of water, but the monumental effort and the strategic thinking behind it are still palpable. This wasn't just engineering, it was empire building, one basket of earth and one regulated stream of water at a time. The control of water wasn't just about sustaining life, it was about shaping society, enforcing order, and demonstrating the king's connection to the cosmic forces that governed existence. It was wet power, in the most literal sense. So you see how controlling the water wasn't just practical, it was political, binding the farmer to the king in a very real, very thirsty way. But these vast water bodies, the berets themselves, were more than just really big ponds for irrigation and showing off royal authority. They were also deeply sacred spaces, imbued with religious and cosmological meaning. Imagine standing beside the West Beret, this enormous rectangle of water stretching out before you, maybe a small island in the middle with a temple on it. It feels different from just standing by a regular lake, doesn't it? There's a deliberate geometry to it, a sense of purpose that goes beyond just holding water. This is where the cosmic symbolism we touched on earlier really comes into play. In Khmer cosmology, influenced heavily by Indian religions like Hinduism and later Buddhism, the universe was often depicted with sacred mountains at its centre, surrounded by oceans. Temples like Angkor Wat represent Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain, and the moat surrounding them. They represent the cosmic ocean. The berets fit into this worldview, but perhaps on a grander, more expansive scale. They were, in a sense, earthly representations of those divine waters, helping to recreate the sacred landscape of the cosmos right there on the Cambodian plain. It's like building a miniature universe in your backyard, but instead of little plastic dinosaurs, you've got water reservoirs the size of small cities. Much wetter, definitely less prone to being stepped on by accident. Building and maintaining these cosmic oceans wasn't just about pondering water, it was a religious act, a way for the king to align himself with the divine order and ensure the prosperity of his realm not just through practical means, but through spiritual merit. The king, by commissioning these monumental waterworks, was mirroring the actions of the gods who ordered the cosmos. He was seen as a sort of earthly steward of the divine waters, ensuring the flow of life and abundance for his people. It was pretty smart branding if you think about it. My irrigation project isn't just about growing rice, it's about keeping the universe running smoothly. Also, please pay your taxes. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the major berets, especially the West Beret and the East Beret, were oriented along cardinal directions, aligning with the symbolic geography of the Khmer capital and its temples. This precise alignment wasn't just for engineering efficiency, it reinforced their role as cosmic replicas, connecting the earthly realm of Angkor to the celestial and mythical realms. The causeways leading to island temples within the berets, like the one at the West Beret leading to the Temple of West Mabon, would have been sites of religious processions and rituals, further integrating the water features into the spiritual life of the empire. You weren't just going for a nice rowboat ride, you were potentially embarking on a symbolic journey across a cosmic ocean. There's a quirky tidbit about West Mabon, the temple on the island in the West Beret. It once housed a massive bronze statue of Vishnu, reclining on the cosmic serpent Ananta, a scene representing the creation of the universe from the cosmic ocean. Finding fragments of such a colossal divine image in the middle of this vast artificial lake really underscores the point. This wasn't just a functional reservoir, it was explicitly designed to be a stage for cosmic drama, a place where the divine met the earthly, and where the king's power was linked to the very act of creation and the sustainment of the world. Imagine discovering that the statue in the middle of your local park's duck pond was actually part of an ancient universe creation diorama. Mind-blowing, right? Historians still argue whether the religious and symbolic functions of the berets were the primary driving force behind their construction, or if these aspects were more of a justification or an added layer of meaning applied to projects that were fundamentally about practical resource management. Was the cosmology the blueprint, or just the fancy wrapping paper for a very large and crucial engineering project? Did the king genuinely believe he was recreating the cosmic ocean, or was he simply using powerful religious symbolism to legitimize his massive infrastructure spending and labor mobilization? It's a classic case of separating the sacred from the pragmatic, which is often impossible in societies where the two were so deeply intertwined. Was it faith or just really effective propaganda? Probably a bit of both, like most things involving large sums of money and large groups of people. Think about the sensory experience again. The cool water, a stark contrast to the dry heat of the surrounding plains. The vast open space offering a sense of peace and immensity. The geometric perfection of the dikes. A human-made boundary holding back a divine flood. These places would have felt special, set apart, not just functionally important, but spiritually charged. They were places for rituals, for circumambulation around the sacred islands, for contemplation of the relationship between the human world, the natural world, especially water, and the divine. It adds another layer to the incredible effort involved in building them. It wasn't just forced labour for practical gain, it was also for many probably labour contributing to a sacred landscape, a merit-making activity on an epic scale. It puts your weekend gardening efforts into perspective, doesn't it? You're just trying not to kill that one succulent. They were building cosmic oceans. So you have this complex picture, structures that were simultaneously vital for irrigation and survival, the instruments of political power and control, and profound religious symbols connecting the earthly realm to the cosmic. The berets weren't one thing, they were all of these things woven together, a physical manifestation of the intricate relationship between the Khmer people, their rulers, their environment, and their gods. They are a reminder that in many ancient societies, the practical and the spiritual were not separate spheres, but deeply integrated aspects of existence. So we've seen how these vast berets were these incredible multifaceted entities, part plumbing system, part political statement, part cosmic mirror. But what about the people? The regular folks who weren't kings or high priests or hydraulic engineers? How did these colossal pools of water, some bigger than entire modern cities, actually touch their daily lives? Beyond just making the rice grow, which, let's be honest, is a pretty fundamental part of daily life, when you're talking about feeding a population of perhaps 1 million people. Imagine you live near one of these berets, maybe not right on its edge, but within the network of canals and smaller ponds connected to it. Your morning routine probably involves water. Not just for drinking and cooking, though access to cleanish water is a huge win in any era, especially before modern sanitation, but also for bathing, washing clothes, maybe just splashing your face to wake up. The Bray through the canal system brought this essential resource close to where people lived, reducing the need for long treks to smaller wells or unpredictable rivers, especially during the dry season. Think of it as the ancient Khmer equivalent of having decent water pressure at home, though maybe without the option for a hot shower. Still, a game changer. The canals weren't just for moving water to the fields or to the houses, they were also roads. You wouldn't hop in your car, obviously, but you'd use a boat or a raft. The Barays and their connecting waterways formed a vast network of transportation routes, allowing people and goods to move around the densely populated urban complex. This facilitated trade, made it easier for administrators to travel, and allowed the king's decrees and tax collectors to reach further flung areas more efficiently. It's like having a network of watery highways crisscrossing the land, making getting around less about hacking through jungle and more about navigating the waterways. Probably less road rage too, unless someone cut you off with their ox-powered barge. And then there's food beyond rice. These huge reservoirs would have teemed with fish. Fishing would have been a significant activity, providing a crucial source of protein for the population. Imagine casting your nets or setting traps in these calm, managed waters, a more reliable source of sustenance than relying solely on river fishing, which can be unpredictable. The Barays weren't just irrigation tanks, they were massive fish farms, albeit unintentional ones initially. You could probably catch dinner without going too far from home, provided you had the right gear, and maybe weren't scared of whatever prehistoric-looking fish lurked in those depths. Probably less variety than a modern supermarket, but hey, it's fresh. A mainstream historical fact is that archaeological evidence, including fish bones found at ancient sites and depictions in temple bas-reliefs, confirms that fishing and the consumption of fish were widespread in the Khmer Empire, and the Barays would have been prime locations for this activity. They weren't just growing grain, they were harvesting aquatic life too, creating a more diverse and resilient food supply for the population centered around Angkor. It was a multi-pronged approach to feeding the masses. Beyond the purely practical, the Barays likely served as social hubs. People would gather by the water's edge. Children would play, carefully, hopefully. Maybe there were market activities along the dikes, or religious festivals involving processions by the water. These weren't just engineering marvels, they were integrated into the social fabric. Picture evenings by the Bray, maybe the sun setting over the water, people chatting after a long day in the fields. It softens the image of just a massive, functional tank, doesn't it? They were part of the landscape of life. There's a quirky tidbit that some historians speculate that the large, flat dikes surrounding the Barays weren't just retaining walls and walkways. They might have also been used for things like drying crops, setting up temporary stalls, or even just as elevated pathways during the rainy season when surrounding land could become quite muddy. They were multi-use structures, like the ancient equivalent of a community park pathway that also serves as a flood defence and occasionally hosts a farmer's market. Efficiency was key, even in seemingly simple construction. Historians still argue whether the benefits of this complex hydraulic system were equally distributed among the population, or if certain groups, perhaps those closer to the capital or with higher social status, had preferential access to water from the Barays and canals, potentially exacerbating social inequalities. Was it a system designed for the collective good, or primarily to benefit the elite and maintain their control over the commoners? Did everyone get their fair share of water for their rice paddies, or were some fields left parched while others thrived, depending on who you knew or where you lived? It adds a layer of potential social tension beneath the impressive engineering. The scale of the Barays would have been awe-inspiring to the average person. Imagine living your whole life with one of these artificial lakes dominating your horizon. It would have been a constant, tangible reminder of the power of the king and the sophistication of your society. It wasn't just a reservoir. It was part of the furniture of your world, a permanent feature that dictated where you farmed, how you travelled, and even how you connected with the divine. It shaped the very landscape of their daily existence in a way that's hard for us to fully grasp today. Living with our relatively small, less imposing infrastructure, your local water tower just doesn't have the same dramatic impact. So the Barays weren't just for the big picture stuff they come on, feeding the empire, legitimizing the king, mirroring the cosmos. They were also the backdrop and, in many ways, the lifeblood of everyday existence for the people of Angkor. They provided water for survival, routes for travel, food for sustenance, and places for community life, all while silently reinforcing the power structure that made it all possible. It was a system deeply woven into the fabric of their world, from the most mundane tasks to the most profound spiritual beliefs. So these berets, these colossal feats of engineering that were so interwoven with daily life, the economy, and even the spiritual world, they weren't invincible. Nothing built by humans truly is, I suppose. You can build a magnificent city sustained by ingenious waterworks, but time, neglect, and unforeseen circumstances can bring it all crumbling down, or in this case, silting up. The glory days of peak Angkorian hydraulic power eventually faded, and the decline of the reservoir system is inextricably linked to the decline of the empire itself. It's like when a finely tuned machine starts sputtering because nobody remembered to change the oil, but on a scale measured in square miles of water. Maintaining a system this vast and complex wasn't a trivial task. It required constant effort, immense labour, and centralised organisation. Canals needed dredging to prevent silt buildup, dikes needed repairing, sluice gates needed monitoring and operation. It was like a massive ongoing infrastructure project that never ended. As long as the central authority was strong, as long as the king commanded the resources and loyalty of the population, this maintenance could be sustained. But what happens when that starts to fray? One of the most insidious enemies of any water management system in a tropical environment is silt. Rivers and canals carry sediment, and over time this sediment settles, filling in reservoirs and waterways. Imagine trying to keep a bathtub full while someone is constantly pouring in buckets of mud. It requires constant scooping out. Without regular dredging, canals narrow, their capacity to carry water diminishes, and eventually sections become impassable or ineffective. The berets themselves, while huge, would also have slowly accumulated sediment, reducing their storage volume over centuries. It's a bit like entropy winning a very slow, very muddy race. Then there are the environmental factors. The climate in Southeast Asia isn't perfectly stable year-round or even century-round. It's subject to monsoon cycles, but also longer periods of drought or intense rainfall. A mainstream historical fact is that paleoclimate data derived from tree rings and sediment cores indicates that the later period of the Khmer Empire experienced significant shifts in rainfall patterns, including prolonged droughts and periods of exceptionally heavy monsoons. How do you manage a system designed for a certain range of conditions when the conditions themselves change drastically? A major drought would deplete the berets and stress the system, while an intense monsoon could cause flooding, damage infrastructure, and dump even more silt into the network. It's a double-edged sword, or perhaps a double-barreled climate shotgun. The human element was just as critical. Maintaining the system required a massive labour force. This wasn't optional, it was the price of sustaining the urban density and agricultural output. As the empire faced external pressures, conflicts with neighbouring kingdoms, particularly Sukhothai and later Ayutthaya, or internal strife, this labour force could be diverted to warfare, or populations might shift away from the capital region due to instability. If the central authority weakened, its ability to mobilise and organise this labour for maintenance would diminish. You can't dredge canals if everyone is busy fighting off invaders or has simply packed up and moved somewhere less chaotic. There's an open, scholarly debate about the primary cause of the decline of the Angkorian hydraulic system and the empire itself. Some historians and archaeologists emphasise the role of environmental change, arguing that the climate shifts were the main catalyst. Others point to political and social factors, like warfare, internal rebellions, or a breakdown in the ruling elite's ability to govern and manage resources. Did the environment make the empire vulnerable to political problems, or did political problems make them unable to cope with environmental challenges? Was it primarily ecological collapse or political implosion? Or most likely, was it a complex, tragic interplay of both, where each problem exacerbated the other? It's like trying to decide if it was the leaky roof or the termites that finally brought the old house down. A quirky tidbit related to the decline is the speculation that as the system began to fail in some areas, people might have resorted to less sustainable practices, like clearing more marginal land for farming or abandoning damaged sections of the canal network, accelerating the overall decay. It could have been a vicious cycle, failure in one part putting more pressure on others, leading to cascading breakdowns rather than a single dramatic collapse. Imagine one small leak in your plumbing system that you ignore, which then causes damp rot, leading to structural issues, and suddenly your entire house is falling apart, because you didn't fix that initial drip. The decline wasn't necessarily sudden, but likely a gradual process of deterioration. As maintenance lagged, the system's efficiency would drop. Rice yields might become less reliable, leading to food shortages or reduced surpluses needed to support the urban population and the elite. This, in turn, could further destabilize the political situation and make it even harder to organize maintenance. It's easy to see how the problems could spiral downwards. The very thing that allowed Angkor to grow so large and powerful, its sophisticated water management, became a potential vulnerability when that management faltered. When the traditional narratives talk about the fall of Angkor, they often mention external invasions, particularly from the Siamese kingdoms. While warfare certainly played a role, many researchers now believe that the environmental stresses and the gradual breakdown of the hydraulic system were equally, if not more, significant factors in the eventual shift of the Khmer capital away from the Angkor region in the 15th century. You can survive an invasion, but it's much harder to sustain 1 million people in a city if your food supply system is failing and your reservoirs are silting up or drying out. So, the berets, these symbols of power and prosperity, ultimately bear witness not just to the ingenuity of the Khmer Empire at its height, but also to the challenges that contributed to its decline in the Angkor region. They stand today as vast, often dry or partially filled, monuments to both incredible human achievement and the unforgiving realities of climate, maintenance, and political stability over centuries. They are a silent reminder that even the most impressive structures require constant care, and sometimes, despite best efforts, the environment and human affairs conspire against them. So the Golden Age of Angkor, powered by these colossal water engines, eventually waned. The capital moved, the vast populations dispersed, and the constant vigilant hand of maintenance lifted. What happens to a machine of that scale when you just walk away? It doesn't vanish, not completely. It slowly succumbs to the relentless forces of nature that it once sought to harness and control. Today you can still see the brays, or rather, the ghosts of them, etched onto the landscape. They don't hold their ancient volumes of water, they don't feed a bustling metropolis, but their forms persist, a silent testament to a time when water was king. If you were to stand on the ground today in many parts of the old Angkorian plain, you might not immediately recognize the vastness of what was there. The forests have grown back in places, rice fields cover the areas that were once irrigated, and time smooths over sharp edges. A beret doesn't look like a giant lake anymore. It looks more like a very large, slightly raised rectangle of earth, surrounding a shallow depression that might fill with water during the monsoon, or remain mostly dry and overgrown for the rest of the year. The dikes, once carefully shaped and perhaps faced with stone, are now just tree-covered mounds or gentle slopes. The complex network of canals? Many are filled in, barely visible as subtle linear changes in vegetation or topography, like faded lines on an ancient map. It took modern technology to truly grasp the scale of what was left. A mainstream historical fact is that remote sensing techniques, particularly airborne LiDAR, light detection and ranging, revolutionized our understanding of the Angkorian landscape in the 21st century. LiDAR can penetrate dense forest canopy and map the ground surface with incredible precision. When archaeologists and geographers applied LiDAR to the Angkor region, it revealed the full extent of the hydraulic system. Not just the visible temples and brays, but hundreds of square kilometers of canals, reservoirs, embankments, and urban features that were hidden beneath the jungle and rice paddies. It was like uncovering an entire hidden city and its life support system, all thanks to bouncing lasers off the ground. Imagine putting on special glasses and suddenly seeing the foundation of every building that ever stood in your town. It was kind of like that, but over an area the size of a small country. So these features are still there, just in a different form. They are archaeological sites, certainly, protected to varying degrees, but they are also subtle landscape features. The West Beret, the largest surviving one near Angkor Thom, still holds a significant body of water in the wet season. A vast, tranquil lake that is used for modern irrigation and even recreation. But the East Beret, equally massive, is largely dry, its footprint clearly visible as raised dikes enclosing a vast, flat area, where villagers sometimes cultivate crops. The northern berets near Preah Khan are less distinct, their lines softer, more integrated into the current landscape. Seeing them from the air, or through the monochrome vision of a LiDAR image, is like looking at the blueprints of a giant's forgotten playground. You can trace the lines of the canals, see where they connected different barrages, how they snake through the ancient city grid. It's a sobering reminder of the sheer effort and planning involved. It wasn't just digging a few ponds, it was terraforming on an epic scale, and even in decay these features influence the local hydrology. They subtly alter drainage patterns, affect the water table, and contribute to the ecosystem in ways we're only beginning to fully understand. There's an open, scholarly debate about the extent to which any part of the ancient hydraulic system remains functionally relevant to modern water management or ecology in the region. Some argue that the remnants of the dikes and canals still play a role in retaining water during the monsoon or influencing groundwater flow, while others contend that centuries of silting and environmental change have rendered them purely historical features with minimal current impact. Are they still quietly doing a little bit of their old job, or are they just very large, very old piles of dirt and depressions? It's a hard question to answer definitively without deep hydrological studies. A quirky tidbit is that some of the local folklore and place names in the region still subtly reference the ancient water features, even if the people living there today don't fully grasp the original purpose or scale. A village might be named after a nearby lake that is now just a seasonal puddle within a beret footprint, or a family might traditionally dig wells in a spot that unknowingly aligns with the long-forgotten canal route because the water table is still slightly higher there. It's like echoes of the past whispering through generations. The legacy of the berets isn't just in their physical remnants, however impressive they are, even in decay. It's also in the knowledge they represent. The Khmer engineers understood complex hydraulic principles, managing flow, controlling levels, distributing water across large distances with minimal elevation change. They understood the climate, the soil, the needs of their staple crop. This knowledge, built up over centuries, allowed a civilization to thrive in a challenging environment. While we have modern tools and understanding, there's still much to learn from their practical, large-scale solutions to water scarcity and surplus. They faced problems that many parts of the world face today: how to store water from wet seasons for use in dry seasons, how to mitigate floods, how to ensure reliable irrigation for agriculture. Standing by the edge of the West Beret today, watching the sunset paint the water in hues of orange and purple, or walking across the dry, cracked earth of the East Beret during the dry season, you feel the weight of history. You see the scale of the ambition, the mastery of the environment, and the eventual vulnerability that came with such dependence. The berets are more than just reservoirs. They are historical documents written in earth and water, telling a story of human ingenuity, power, decline, and the enduring presence of the natural world. They are a quiet reminder that even the most monumental achievements can fade, but their lessons, if we look closely enough, might still flow through the landscape waiting to be rediscovered. They rest now, these vast water bodies of the past, under the sun and the rain, slowly eroding, slowly changing, becoming part of the very earth from which they were shaped. Their work is done, their era past, leaving only their silent forms behind, waiting for the patient observer to listen to the stories they still hold. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As we drift now away from the ancient dikes and the long-vanished canals, let the images of those vast, silent spaces soften in your mind. The scale of it all, the sheer human effort stretching across centuries, the water flowing, the rice growing, let it all gentle into a hazy, distant echo. Think of the slow passage of time, the way mountains wear down, and rivers change course, and even the grandest human creations eventually settle back into the earth. There's a quiet comfort in that cycle, isn't there? A reminder that we are all part of something much larger, much slower, much more peaceful than the busy rush of our days. The air is still now. Perhaps you can feel a cool breeze from the window, or the soft whir of a fan, or maybe just the stillness that comes when the world outside begins to quiet down. Let your breathing slow, easy and steady, like the gentle rise and fall of a calm tide. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, just this moment, this breath, this quiet space. The history has unfolded, the stories have been told, and now it is time for rest. Let the weight fall from your shoulders, let the thoughts quiet down like ripples smoothing out on a still surface. You are safe now, warm and comfortable, drifting towards sleep. The berets are ancient history, the water flows only in memory, and all that remains is peace.